Hey everybody, welcome back to Serial Killer Saturdays on Cowboy Criminology. I'm Derek Judd, your host, and of course I am the Cowboy Criminologist. So it's been a couple weeks since I've been able to do one of these, uh, but I think I've got a pretty good one for y'all today. And this one kind of came about, not really accidentally, but my mom is visiting a friend of hers from high school. And my mom is a huge supporter of the channel. Uh, she's always sharing the links, and she's always bragging to people what I'm doing, what I'm putting out. And true crime being very popular, the friend that she's going to visit, her name's Mel. Mel asked my mom if I'd ever heard of Faryion Wardrip, and I told her that I had, and I kind of went down the identifying stuff that I knew about him. But I kind of laugh because it's it's kind of become something of a parlor game, a party trick that my family members like to pull out whenever somebody mentions a certain serial killer or true crime event. Uh, a lot of times, my family will bring up my knowledge, and it'll usually be met with something of, "Well, I bet he's never heard of," and then that family member will get in touch with me, and more often than not, I actually have heard of the event, or I've heard of the killer. And if I don't know them by name, I'll usually know them by moniker, or sometimes I'll need some details of the crime, like where it occurred, and kind of trips my brain. It is y'all need to understand that I've been studying serial killers for probably about 25 years now, and I have read so many books and so much literature that it is very difficult to kind of keep them all straight and everything. So, for my mom's friend Mel, we're doing a special on Faryion Wardrip. Mel, we're praying for you. We hope you get better soon, and thank you so much for being such a great friend to my mom. She told me how you helped her through some really hard times, and so this is a special Cowboy Criminology Serial Killer Saturday just for you. All right, but for the rest of y'all, I hope you enjoy it. Okay. I tried to do something new with the introduction. I know it's a little on the long side, but it actually has a little more information and everything, just to kind of give you. I'm trying to standardize what I'm doing, and I'm trying to give you some more background information. And so in the opening slide, you got some information about him. He's 25 years old when he committed his first murder. 27 years old when he was convicted. 6'5", very tall guy, 202 pounds. From that photo and the fact that he was abusing intravenous drugs at the time, I would imagine that 200 pounds came after his incarceration, and probably not during that time. That picture, he looks like he's about 175, maybe 180 on a good day. But in that booking photo, you can tell he looks pretty emaciated. So when I was looking up more specific information about Faryion Wardrip, I tried to find his IQ. It's so weird when you're talking about serial killers. Either they're dumber than dirt but exceptionally lucky, or they're these Hannibal Lecter evil genius types that only get caught by the dumb luck of the officers. And so it's really weird, but a lot of the information that I got actually came from Roy Hazelwood. And if you're new to the channel, you're new to Cowboy Criminology, and you've never heard the name Roy Hazelwood before, if this is your first time hearing it, I think about once every 3 or 4 videos, I mention John Douglas, Robert Ressler, and Roy Hazelwood, the big 3 FBI profilers. 3 law enforcement officers have been inspirational in kind of helping guide my knowledge of criminology. But Roy Hazelwood actually has a remarkable connection to this case, and you'll see that as we kind of go through. He's currently 65 years old. He is still alive. He was born March 6, 1959 in Salem, Indiana. Never completed high school, 11th grade education. He's worked as a clerk, janitor, orderly, laborer, buyer, and a Sunday school teacher. The FBI classification for him is mixed, and I don't think we've really dug really deep into that, but the FBI classifies serial killers or violent offenders as organized, disorganized, or mixed. Organized serial killers basically their actions are planned out. They know what the crime is going to be. They know where it's going to be. They know who it's going to be. They know what they're going to take with them. They know what they're going to remove from the scene. They know they plot out escape routes. If they're going to take somebody, they already have a dump site scouted out ahead. Ted Bundy, Dennis Rader, Ed Kemper are all examples of organized serial killers. Okay. Disorganized serial killers, we've talked about Herbert Mullins, not Richard Ramirez. Richard Trenton Chase was a disorganized serial killer. All right, very easy to catch, and most often they're suffering from an extreme form of mental illness, usually like schizophrenia or something like that. That makes them very easy to catch. Once the profile is established and you can kind of focus the investigation towards a certain type of behavior, all these light bulbs come on, and that's why the profile that Robert Ressler did on Richard Trenton Chase was so phenomenal. And you can hear more about that if you go back to one of my first videos about vampires. Pretty good video, if I do say so myself, and I just did. Holmes and DeBurger, one of many groups that fight the FBI about how they classify these types of offenders. And the big argument comes down to saying that the mixed representation, which I believe Faryion Wardrip actually fits inside of, and I'll explain more of that as we kind of get into his pathology, his psychopathology. Mixed presentation offenders take traits from organized and disorganized alike, and it can be very difficult when you're presented with a mixed type offender, because that could tell you so many different things. That could tell you you're dealing with multiple suspects. It could tell you that what started off as an organized event devolved for some reason, kind of like the way Ted Bundy was caught. It can be very difficult, and so a lot of criminologists have said that the FBI's classification is essentially useless. And I've read several different classification systems. I tend to like the FBI's more for simplicity. I think because that's what I was first exposed to. It makes the most sense to me. And even though I do see where people kind of get hung up in the minutia of organized, mixed, and disorganized, I feel more comfortable kind of operating in that. Now, I did find a model from Holmes and DeBurger, and Holmes and DeBurger have established 4 types of violent serial offenders. You have lust, thrill, power control, And there's one more. I'll put that up in the video. But not only did I classify Wardrip as mixed under the FBI classification, but the Holmes and DeBurger classification, I believe he's power and control. And as we start talking about going into his psychopathology and we start looking at his crimes and everything, you're going to kind of see how I came up with that. Another interesting thing about Wardrip is he has no signature. And getting started in criminology, a lot of people always want a signature. They want something that they can attach to the killer, so that we know it's them. Unabomber Ted Kaczynski, he always used wood in his packages. There was always some kind of clever wordplay with the or anagram with the labeling of the package, and so it was very consistent. His bombs were very consistent, and bombers, by their meticulous nature, almost exclusively will always have a signature unless they're trying to set up another bomber, or they're just getting started and they're trying to do their own thing by copying somebody else's work. As far as other serial killers, the Boston Strangler, Robert DeSalvo, he liked tying these really intricate knots in the ligatures that he used to bind his victims. And it was noted that where those ligatures were used, his daughter was in leg braces, and he had tied festive little bows onto the braces to make the braces look more cheerful, And so kind of a weird thing. A lot of times, what people get wrong is a signature is a psychopathology. It is something that the offender has to do, and a lot of times they're not really even aware of it. Albert DeSalvo probably didn't realize that he had this particular way of tying a knot. But like with Dennis Rader, BTK, he kind of went out of his way to develop his own signature. Of course, he gave himself a nickname, and we can do a video about him later on. But sometimes when you have those killers who are reaching out and they're contacting the media, they give themselves a name, they're establishing a signature for themselves. That really tells you a whole lot more about how the unsub views themselves, as opposed to any type of expression of their psychology, what they may have gone through. Faryion Wardrip actually has no signature. There was nothing that really tied him to any of the killings except for the 9-month time frame in which the killings occurred, the close proximity in which the killings occurred. And because of those things, those were really the only things that pointed to him once they zeroed in on him as a suspect. Wichita Falls, it's not a terribly big city. It's about 3 hours northwest of Dallas. And it's not a huge city, not a big metropolitan area. And yeah, it has its share of crimes for a city its size, but when you have 4 homicides that seem to happen in a pretty rapid succession, 9 months, I'm calling a rapid succession, it almost excludes anything other than a serial killer, unless you can tie it to another event. Okay. A lot of times in law enforcement, officers are really, especially administration, are very hesitant about telling the public that they have a serial killer out there. There's two reasons that happens. One, their lack of experience dealing with serial killers, and two, the lack of understanding from the public about serial killers. So, and elected officials, as a general rule, try to avoid creating a panic where they don't have to. So his years active, December 21st, 1984 was his first killing. His last killing was May 6, 1986. But Wardrip has some pretty substantial milestones in his background. As far as his family life, he's a lot like Richard Cottingham. There really wasn't anything in his life. You know, he had a big family. His dad worked hard. He was a machinist. He was the fifth out of 9 kids. So, you know, he may not have had everything in the world that he wanted, but by all accounts, he was taken care of. He wasn't abused. He wasn't neglected. So, although I think if you come from a family that big, I think it's, especially if you're not the firstborn or the last, I think it's real easy to feel, kind of get that Jan Brady syndrome going, where you think like everything's about everybody else, and you're just kind of left to fend for yourself. But Wardrip has some substantial, in his adult life, he has some pretty substantial milestones. And he served in the Army Reserves for a little less than 6 years. And in 1978, he was discharged, given a less than honorable discharge for smoking marijuana. He was not at his duty post when he was supposed to be. And he had several run-ins with his superiors that basically, once they added up everything else, they just didn't think he was a good fit, and so they gave him a less than honorable discharge. He ends up in Wichita Falls, where he marries a local woman, has 2 children with her. That same year, he starts working at a hospital, same hospital that one of his victims works at, his second victim, Tony Gibbs. And by the end of that year, he's promoted to orderly. And orderly is somebody in a hospital who just kind of helps run errands for the doctors and nurses. You know, they're busy doing 1,000 other things, and orderlies kind of like the truck drivers of the hospital. You know, they just kind of keep things moving, and the hospitals are lucky to have them. In 1984, he starts having some marital difficulties, and you're going to see how that starts kind of seeping in from his marriage life into his personal life, and it starts to affect how he sees himself and how he thinks the world sees him. 1985, he and his wife split for good, and 4 days after his 4th victim, Ellen Blau is found dead. He left his job. So he's got kind of an interesting history, but you can kind of see where the progression is. And remember, I told you that according to Holmes and DeBurger, he would be a power and control type offender. And you will see in a lot of power control type offenders that they have an image of themselves, and when that image is not bolstered, especially in a romantic relationship or a working relationship, they tend to lose track of that, and they start to develop into somebody who doesn't take rejection very well. They don't take criticism very well. They start to feel like everybody's against them. Everybody is against them. This is also, and if you're kind of tracking this, you can also start to see where a mental health professional might give the diagnosis of antisocial personality disorder. I firmly believe that's what he had, and I'm not a mental health professional, But gun to my head, if somebody was like, "Hey, what mental illness do you think this person has?" I'd say he has a personality disorder, antisocial personality. All right. So, so let's talk about that. So we said in '84 he starts to have marriage difficulties. All right. He's had 2 kids, and things just are not going his way. All right. So on December 21st, Terry Sims, 21-year-old nursing student and EKG tech at a local hospital, uh, was staying with a friend of hers, another young lady who's a nurse. Her name's Lisa Boone, and Lisa Boone was renting this nice little 2-bedroom house. And when Lisa found out that she had to work a double shift, well, Terry was just going to be staying the night, so Lisa gives her extra key. Let's Terry stay the night, which was not unusual for them. It was very common for Terry to stay over. So the next morning, Terry gets off of working her overnight shift. She comes back home. She knocks on the door, and she gets no answer. And usually, when she knocked on the door, Terry would wake up and come let her in, and they would get on about their day. But after a few tries, when she couldn't raise Terry, Lisa walked around the house and she gets to the kitchen window and she sees the kitchen light's been on, which is very unusual, very out of character for Terry to do. She was very conscious about turning the lights off. So Lisa decides she's going to go to her landlord's house and get the extra key. She comes back home, unlocks the door, and when she walks in, she immediately realizes something's wrong. In the living room, one of the stereo speakers that she had is turned over. She starts noticing that there are some garments and some toilet paper that have blood on them. Not a whole lot, but enough that she thinks something's probably wrong. Something is nagging at her, and she can't make herself go any further into the home. So she goes back to her landlord's house, explains the situation. The landlord comes in, and in the bathroom, he finds Terry Sims bound with an electrical cord that had been cut from the waterbed heater in Lisa Boone's room. This is very important when we're trying to establish a mixed personality type according to the FBI criteria. Okay, obviously you can see the power and control. He bound her. He also beat her very savagely. It's believed that he tried to choke her and then he stabbed her. Part of being an organized offender, like I said, is you take everything with you. And anything you take into the home, you take with you when you leave. Okay? The knife, the edged weapon that was used to kill Terry Sims was never found. So what's odd about that is when he came in, he had no plan to, or this wasn't planned out, I guess is the best way to say it. But at some time while Wardrip was in there, he cuts the extension cord, uses that to bind Terry Sims, and then leaves. Doors locked behind him. Nobody's any the wiser, and he's left to kind of do his own thing. When Terry was found, the only thing she was wearing were her socks, and her clothes had been pulled off of her. And one of the ways that investigators can tell if somebody took their clothes off by themselves, they're usually very organized. Now, most of the time, you take off your clothes, even if they're inside out, you have a tendency to put them in a hamper, you have a tendency to fold them, you have a tendency to turn them right side out. not very often do you find clothes where half of the buttons are open and the shirt is pulled off and thrown into one corner. Uh, Pants, when they are pulled off of somebody, tend to have one leg turned inside out or both legs turned inside out. And so just by looking at the clothes, you can tell that whatever happened in that home was violent, and it came on very quickly. All right. Now Terry Sims, she had fought to the best of her ability. And the terrifying thing about this is, and I think her cousin really hit the nail on the head, but just based on Terry's personality and how she was with people, and how she cared for herself, and was very big about promoting safety to her fellow coworkers and people that she knew. But she wasn't an alarmist. She didn't sit there just living in fear that the boogeyman was coming out to get her. That wasn't the way she lived her life. But one of her cousins said that she wasn't killed because of who she was. He believed that she was killed because she would be able to identify her attacker. Another interesting thing is, and you're gonna see this throughout, is that there's a lack of overkill. Now, the killings we're going to discuss are very violent, and out of respect to the victims and their families, I'm not going to go through and describe in great detail what happened. All you need to know that his method of, or his modus operandi, was asphyxiation, beating with the fist, and stabbing. Okay. And sexual assault, of course, was present there as well. And so you can kind of see where I'm coming up with the mixed identity. You know, he had enough presence of mind to take whatever he used to murder Terry out of the house, but he didn't plan the crime so that he'd be able to tie her up. So very very typical of a mixed offender. So I think the best way I heard this described was like this: the violence inflicted upon Terry was not methodical and calculated, but frenzied and chaotic. It's another sign of a disorganized offender. Okay, so it's not just enough to say organized, disorganized, or mixed. You actually have to know what the characterization types are, why those types exist, why those typologies exist, and then you got to go into your victimology, you got to go into your crime scene, and it turns into this whole turns into your whole it's the beginning of your whole profile. So Terry Sims, like all of his victims, were low risk. They didn't engage in super risky behavior. One of the victims kind of did, but she wasn't naive. She didn't just think that everybody was essentially good, and she never did anything to protect herself. But we'll talk about her coming up. What gets me about Faryion Wardrip is that he had no discernible post-offense behavior. He didn't just up and quit his job. He didn't become distant from family or friends, or at least not to any extent that anybody really noticed. He just kind of went on with life like nothing happened. And that's a little unusual for a serial killer. Usually there's some kind of manic high followed by a really low depression, and they have trouble kind of riding that wave until they hit an equilibrium. Okay. So January 19th, 1985, Tony Gibbs, 24, she's a nurse at another area hospital. where Faryion Wardrip happened to be an orderly. January 22nd of 85, her white 1984 Camaro is found in a street 2 blocks away from Lisa Boone's house where Terry Sims was murdered. There's not really anything odd about the vehicle. The doors are locked. It's legally parked. There's really nothing ominous about it. And even when when law enforcement gets there and they open the doors, they see a couple spots of blood, but nothing that could really tell them anything sinister happened. But they look closer and they see on the center console by the emergency brake, there's some white shoe polish. And nurses of the time would wear white shoes and they'd go over them with white shoe polish. And so the scuff marks were from that white shoe polish. But it wasn't just on the emergency brake, it was also on the center of the steering wheel, which would tell an investigator that somebody was either drugged from one side of the car to the other, or pulled from one side of the car to the other. And so now they're starting to look, but then they find her purse. It's undisturbed. Her ID, her cash, everything is still in there. Okay. She's also wearing, or known to have been wearing, some moderately priced jewelry. But when you see valuable things just laying there, you know that robbery or burglary is not the motive. You know that's not what this individual was after. The only thing so things are starting to add up, but the thing that really struck the investigators as odd is, I want you to think about this. If you share a car with somebody, that's a husband, a boyfriend, wife, girlfriend, family member, what have you. All right. If you're not both the exact same height and the exact same build, if you think about it, you probably move the seat forward, move the seat back. Well, both of the seats in this Camaro, and Camaros are a small car. Even in the 80s, they were not designed for really anybody over 6 foot. But the seats were pushed all the way back as far as they were, both the driver's side and the passenger's side. Why is this important? Well, Tony Gibbs was about 5 feet tall. So we would expect, from an investigative standpoint, that she would sit closer to the steering wheel so that her legs could so that her feet could reach the pedals and see over the dashboard and all that stuff. Back where the seat was found, there'd be no way she could reach the pedals. And the fact that that was observed by the investigators on scene is very, very impressive. It seems like something you should always be looking for, but it's such an easy detail to overlook that the fact that it was recognized is just awesome. So her body was found about a month later by a utility worker in a rural field. I'd mentioned that she had been wearing some moderately priced jewelry. When her body was found, her jewelry was still attached. So if the purse wasn't enough to convince you that robbery wasn't the motive, when you find her body and you see that her jewelry is still attached and her clothes are not, that tells you right there. This is not a robbery. So somewhere in this field, close to where Tony was found, there's an abandoned trolley car, train car, whatever you want to call it. And inside that car was a horrific scene. The investigators described just about every surface in there as being soaked in blood. Like Terry Sims, Tony Gibbs was beaten. She was stabbed repeatedly. Like I said, no overkill, in Wardrip's crimes, which means that he didn't try to obliterate the face, he didn't mutilate, and I know this seems like you're kind of making a distinction without a difference. The FBI criteria for overkill for stab wounds requires 20 or more stab wounds before it's considered overkill. And most of his victims never had more than 12, I think. There were no drag marks in the field, and based on the evidence that the coroner could determine, he believes that Tony was left for dead inside this cart, and more than likely, Wardrip thought she was dead, and there was no way she was going to. Well, obviously, there's no way she was going to survive. But Tony made an effort to try and go get help, and she just ended up collapsing and succumbing to her injuries. So, what kind of person was Tony? All right. Remember, victimology. We need to tell me about your victim, and I will tell you about your killer. Okay. She's independent. She's fun-loving. All right. She liked going out. She liked having a good time. She had a couple of country western bars that she liked to hang out at. But she never was known to put herself in bad situations. Like, she wouldn't pick up a hitchhiker. She wouldn't pick up anybody she didn't know. She wouldn't open the door for anybody she didn't know. She was very safety conscious. And when things were out of the ordinary, for example, her brothers, when Roy Hazelwood was talking to them, interviewing them to try and help put a profile together, and that's, like I said, that's where you start. You start with your victimology. They said that she had reported to local law enforcement that she had been getting some harassing phone calls from a stalker. And the phone calls were telling her where she had been all day, all the stops that she made, what she was wearing, and it really creeped her out. And unfortunately, the timing of this is all just coincidental, because the phone calls had absolutely nothing to do with why Tony was murdered. Even though it certainly sets the scene, but that right there, that goes to victimology. All right, that tells you right there was already something in there that heightened her awareness. So she's already observant about what's going on around her. So when you look at it like that, you have to know, okay, now I see it. If she was that committed to her safety, and she even reported to the authorities that she was getting these phone calls, it tells you right there that picking up strangers in, one night stands, engaging in what is considered by the FBI to be high risk behavior, that wasn't her. The one thing that came out of this, and this is stupid, but it's not on the part of law enforcement. All right, so there's a guy who comes into play. His name's Danny Laughlin, and Danny Laughlin is a barback at one of the country western bars that Tony likes to go to. And a barback is an entry level position in the bar. You get glassware, you restock the liquor, you refill the ice, you take dishes back to the kitchen if you don't have a dishwasher there at your bar, or if you're the barback, you are the dishwasher. So it's kind of a menial job. But for reasons that I just I can't fathom, because I understand why he did it, and at the same time, I'm telling you right now, I still can't understand why he did it. By the way, I'm not sponsored by Dr. Pepper. I just, like most Texans, I have a mild Dr. Pepper addiction. So I have very few vices. That's one I'm going to hang on to. All right. So Danny, he goes around and he tells the police that a few days before Tony's body's found, he was walking his dog in that same field. Yeah, interesting. Why in the world would you tell law enforcement that you were walking your dog in a field where a body was found if you didn't see the body? Okay. So what ended up happening is he was trying to set up an alibi for a burglary he had pulled. Now, Danny, he's not the greatest criminal in the world. In fact, he made a bunch of really bad life decisions. So he tries to finagle this whole pseudo involvement with Tony Gibbs' murder. And a jailhouse informant says that, oh, what do you know? Danny told me everything. He spilled the beans. I know how he did it. I know how it happened. I think the jailhouse informant said that Danny and Tony were using drugs together, and Tony was not known to use drugs. So, as you know, most nurses, they have their license. They're not going to risk that license for a quick high with a bar back. Sorry. Sorry. Yeah, it happens in certain kinds of videos, but it doesn't happen in real life. All right, just so you know. All right. So he actually goes on trial for Tony Gibbs' murder because the jailhouse snitch gave all of his information and another person, and you will get this in homicide investigations. Witnesses will come out of the woodwork, whether they've witnessed anything or not. And she testified that she saw Danny Laughlin walking a dog that looked like a wolf in this field on that day. When they bring charges against Danny, nothing sticks. He's got a hung jury, and the district attorney at the time didn't believe that there was going to be enough evidence to try him again, to try to secure a conviction. Unfortunately, in 1993, Danny's killed in a horrible car accident somewhere around Cripple Creek, Colorado. But 1993, the Wichita Falls district attorney has been made aware of this new forensic tool that is sweeping the country and closing cases right, left, and center. It's a little 3-letter abbreviation called DNA. And that DNA test conclusively linked Terry Sims and Tony Gibbs' homicides together and eliminated Danny Laughlin officially. Again, no post-offense behavior. So September 20th, 1985, Ellen Blau, 21-year-old, independent, made her own money. She worked as a waitress. She worked as a cook. The interesting thing is she was very self-conscious about the fact that she came from money. And she had a mindset where she wanted to do things on her own. And she took very, very little help from her parents. And really the only big thing that they did for her was they bought her a 1980 Volkswagen Rabbit convertible. And that was really the only thing that she ever took. But she was spontaneous. She was fun. She had a life plan for herself that was going to be done on her terms. Kind of a cool way to live her life. All right. As far as the FBI scale of low, medium, or high risk, she's kind of medium risk. She doesn't take chances that she doesn't know the risk to. She's not oblivious to the fact that things are dangerous. Like one time, she moved across the country because her boyfriend was in the Air Force. Her parents talked her to coming back and graduating from high school. As soon as she was done, she went right back to Wichita Falls to be with her Air Force boyfriend. When that fizzled out, uh, apparently one time she decided to jump into a cab with a truck driver and head to California, and ended up calling her roommate when she got to the West Coast and said, "Hey, didn't want you to worry. I'm in California." Didn't seem to think that was a big deal. So it wasn't out of character for her to do big, impulsive things, but she didn't ever just. She always knew. She always understood the risk, and by all accounts, she was very good about not putting herself in bad situations. Okay. Now she is actually the fourth victim. Okay. Now if you're playing along at home, we have Terry Sims, we have Tony Gibbs, and now we have Ellen Blau. But wait a minute, what happened to number three? Well, we'll get to her in a second. Um, when when Ellen came up missing, she didn't show up to her for her shift where she was working as a cook. So her boss called her roommate, and her boss called the police and said, "Hey, yeah, she has a habit of being impulsive and a little bit flighty, but when she's scheduled to be somewhere, she's here." So, to the credit of the Wichita Falls Police Department, especially in the early '80s, they took it seriously, and they went out, started looking, got a description of her vehicle, and it wasn't too long until a delivery driver had pulled in behind a store and saw the Volkswagen Rabbit, 1980 Volkswagen Rabbit convertible that Ellen Blau owned. He knew Ellen Blau, and he's like, "This is not right. She's got no reason to be parked back here. She's got no reason to be here at this time of day." So he calls law enforcement. Law enforcement shows up. There's something a little more unusual about this. The windows are rolled up, doors are unlocked, keys in the ignition, and the key was in the on position, so probably ran down the battery. They find some shards of glass that look like they belong to a beer bottle, but her purse is still there. Had a couple $100 in there. So once again, vehicles in place, valuables are in place. We eliminate robbery as a suspect or as a motive. Um, about 3 weeks later, Ellen is found in a field, and she's completely naked except for one sock. And she had been out in the elements so long that her remains had begun to mummify and skeletonize. Now, she did have expensive jewelry. She was known to be wearing a lady's Rolex, which was found about 9 feet away from her body. But like Terry Sims, like Tony Gibbs, she sustained similar types of injuries, asphyxiation, beating, and stabbing. All that information that I just gave you kind of came about in a roundabout way after Faryion Wardrip was arrested, because of the condition of her body, all that the coroner could say with 100% certainty is her cause of death was a violent homicide, undetermined violent homicide. I think is what they called it. So now you've got three victims, all killed within a very short time span of each other. And Barry Maka, who is the district attorney for Wichita County, where Wichita Falls is, he puts together a cold case unit in January of 1997. This cold case investigator is a guy named John Little. And I don't know a whole lot about John Little. I couldn't find out a lot about his training or education. I think he used to be I think he was a tradesman, a bricklayer. That sounds right. But his insights into this investigation were absolutely phenomenal, and I will champion John Little in this case 1,000%. So they're putting together a cold case unit, and they've got 3 homicides. And most of your cold case units usually deal with kidnapping and murder, because murder has no statute of limitations anywhere in the United States, and kidnapping has a very long statute of limitations. And in some parts, or in some jurisdictions, it has uh, no statute of limitations. So Barry Maka he's heard about the behavioral science unit at Quantico, Virginia, part of the FBI. Uh, so he's like, you know what? We've tried everything else. Call the behavioral analysis unit and see if they can't put me in touch with somebody. So he gets in touch with fellow Texan Roy Hazelwood. And as Maka is explaining, going through the 3 crimes, and he's trying to figure out whether they've all been committed by the same person. Hazelwood was able to say, even without the DNA, even before he knew about that Sims and Gibbs were absolutely part of the series. Now, Ellen Blau, with the lack of information that he had, he stopped short of saying, yes, with 100% certainty, Ellen Blau is part of this. But he said that there was enough similarity that he was comfortable saying all 3 of these cases are connected. And so this was his reasoning on how he connected the cases. And every time I read this, I learned something new, and I just think, man, Hazelwood he's a genius. So all the crimes occurred in the early morning hours, all involved sharp instruments, all had no overkill, no head or facial fractures. All the victims fought their attacker, no thefts, they were all found naked, clothing was left behind, shoes were left tied, indicating that they were pulled off. At least one pant leg was inside out, suggesting that a struggling victim had them forcefully removed. They were alone when they were attacked. The victims were left where they were killed. Geography and time frame point to the same killer being responsible. And I think that's absolutely amazing that he was able to make that comparison. One thing I forgot to mention about Ellen Blau is where she was found, there was a broken beer bottle found near her. And like I said, her remains had deteriorated so much that knowing what exactly happened to her was unknown. But the bottle that they found, the shards matched the shards that were found inside her vehicle. Once again, no post-offense behavior, no manic high, no real low, nothing disturbing. Didn't leave to go find work or anything like that yet. Okay. So now we're going to go to the 5th victim. May 6, 1986, Tina Kimbrough, 21, was found dead in her apartment. She had been violently struck on the head and smothered with a pillow. Now, if I was hearing this without the context of prior knowledge, and I'm hearing this for the first time, I'm probably gonna say Tina Kimbrough had nothing to do with this. Okay. But this is how we start to make that connection. Okay. So May 10th, 1986, Faryion Wardrip gets off a bus in Galveston, Texas, on the Gulf Coast. And he wants to see the ocean because he's going to kill himself. This is the post-offense behavior that we're looking for. This is that real low, that huge depression that a lot of serial killers get themselves into. calls Galveston police, and he decides he's going to turn himself in. And he tells them, I killed a really good friend of mine in Wichita Falls. Anytime you call law enforcement and you admit to a homicide, you're going to get a lot of attention. You don't believe me? Ask Ed Kemper. He had an entire police force come to extract him out of a phone booth in Pueblo, Colorado. So this is where we start to see kind of the veil of Wardrip fall, and we start to really kind of understand who he is at his core. He had met Tina Kimbrough at the same club where Tony Gibbs liked to hang out. And he and Tina struck up a friendship. They'd gone out to eat a couple of times. Nothing romantic, always friendly. But there was more than a casual relationship there. Wardrip finds himself on the outs. He finds himself needing a place to stay. And he goes to Tina Kimbrough's home. She invites him in. They start talking, and he gets to the uncomfortable, hey, need to ask you for a favor. I need a place to stay for a few days. Tina's not comfortable with it. She tells him no. Sparks an argument. Things get said. And the next thing you know, he's on top of her. He's asphyxiating her, and he uses a pillow to smother her. So at this time, the Kimbrough murder is the only murder that Wardrip is charged with. And I think the only reason he was charged with this is because he did have a tenuous connection to his other victims. But Tina was somebody that he viewed as a friend. And the fact that he was able to do that to a friend led him to believe that, and this is just me spitballing, but I think he actually feared that he would go after his ex-wife and attack his ex-wife. And obviously, if you kill somebody that close to you, you are going to be a person of interest. And so he just decided to give himself up. On the way back to Wichita Falls from Galveston, an interesting conversation happens. So you got Wardrip in the back of the car, you got two officers, they're making the drive from Galveston to Wichita Falls, which is a distance. And as they're talking, Wardrip lets it slip very casually that he knows Ellen Blau. Now, for me, anytime a suspect mentions a person, place, or thing that is part of an ongoing investigation, that's going to kind of make my little law enforcement antenna perk up, and I'm going to go, what did you say? But for whatever reason, it was enough that the officers documented he said it, but not enough to relay any of that information to a supervisor, a detective, the district attorney, nothing. All right. So he ends up with a 35-year sentence, and he does 11 years of that, and he's released on parole. He's released. He moves to a little town called Olney. He's forced to wear an ankle monitor, which he doesn't like. And almost immediately after his release, he starts petitioning to have restrictions lifted. With the ankle monitor, he can only go to work, home, and church. This puts us in 1997, okay? 1997, he finds himself work. He's gainfully employed. He's going to church, becomes very active in the local Church of Christ there in Olney, and ends up getting married, becomes a Sunday school teacher. And like most serial killers out on parole, yeah, I know. We've talked about this. I promise y'all, I don't just pick these guys who get out on parole and then go on to commit other violent offenses. It's just a predictable pattern of behavior. But as one author said, because he changed his story, it was a vehicular homicide. It was a bar fight. The bar fight is common. If somebody ever tells you they killed somebody in a bar fight, that's why they were in prison, I can guarantee that they're lying. All right, unless you were there to see it or heard about it on the news, they're lying to you. All right. So with all this going on, we now go back to March 29th of 1985. The murder of a Fort Worth woman named Deborah Taylor, age 25, wife and mother. Once again, no post-offense behavior. Actually, I take that back. There's a little bit here because this is right after the Tony Gibbs murder, and he goes to Fort Worth, Texas, looking for work. Now, Wichita Falls to Fort Worth is not. It's not a great distance. It's not certainly something you do on a commute every day, but I do think that there was part of him that was trying to get away, trying to put distance between himself. And obviously he wasn't successful, but he came back. But the interesting thing is come back to 1997. We were just talking about how these guys like to make plausible but unlikely excuses about why they were incarcerated. Bar fight, vehicular homicide, something like that. Something that makes it sound like it could have happened to anybody. But an author who wrote a book about him has the greatest quote about Faryion Wardrip you'll ever hear. He'd climb a tree to lie before he'd tell the truth on the ground. And I think that just sums up so much of what these guys are like, okay? So let's talk about his apprehension, okay? So we talked about Barry Maka getting in touch with Roy Hazelwood, behavioral science unit, and he's going through and he's getting a profile kind of put together. And the profile reads like this. White male, 24 to 30 at the time of the crimes. Lack of emotional maturity compared to his age. Reacts angrily to rejection, real or perceived. Selfish, no concern for welfare or safety of others. Projects macho image to friends and associates. Because of how the killings took place, blood doesn't bother the unsub, and the use of sharp weapons showed that he was employed in a skilled or semi-skilled profession and required him to be physically fit. Lack of overkill shows that his anger is controlled. If he served in the armed forces, he is unlikely to have completed his tour due to dislike of authority and rules. Was or is married, but may have a record of sexual infidelity. High school education, trade or technical training. Lack of planning suggests only average intelligence. Low to lower middle class, lived close to the Boone residence, and was highly impulsive. At the time of the Sims murder, he was experiencing one of the big six stressors: relationship, family, health, job, financial, or legal. Likely criminal history would include disorderly conduct offenses and resisting arrest. Murders did not affect him, with no remorse or guilt. Now, I think Tony Gibbs and Tina Kimbrough kind of blow that out of the water. I think there was something there, just because he did know Tony Gibbs and he was friends with Tina Kimbrough, and so I think he tried to distance himself from what he was doing, but obviously wasn't able to control himself because he ended up killing Deborah Taylor in Fort Worth. Okay, so Maka receives this information. And this is around July 1997. And so he gets with John Little. Maka gets with John Little, and he says, John, okay, here's what we're going to do. We got this profile from the FBI. Maybe it goes somewhere, maybe it doesn't. But I'd like you to take the profile, and I'd like you to take what we know about the cases, and I'd like you to reapply the profile to every single case. So John's like, I've got nothing else to do, and this is the best lead we've had, so let's give it a shot. So as he's going through the old case files and he's reapplying everything, this is what he finds out. Wardrip and his wife lived in the same small apartment complex as Ellen Blau, which was 2 blocks from Lisa Boone's house. He also worked as an orderly in the same hospital as Tony Gibbs, a nurse. Okay. That is very little degrees of separation in a case like this. And it's easy to sit there and say, well, you said Wichita wasn't a small town. It's not. But when you can be positively connected in 1 or 2 degrees to 3 victims, that doesn't look good for you, okay? So when all this comes about, John Little figures out, man, Wardrip has to be our guy. He's the only person that shows up in all 3 investigations. So John Little starts putting Wardrip under surveillance and starts watching him. Goes to Olney, follows him for a few days, and like most investigations, nothing happens the first hour, the first minute, the first day. All right, it doesn't happen. Everybody wishes it does, but it doesn't. Okay. So for several days, he's watching Wardrip, and Wardrip hasn't even so much as spit on the sidewalk, which is interesting because John Little is a dipper. Okay. If you don't know what dip is, that's that real fine tobacco that people put in their lip. Yeah, I know a lot of officers who do it. I think it's a disgusting habit. I even know some female officers who do it, and I can't imagine kissing a girl who smokes. I can't imagine kissing a girl with a wad of dip in her mouth. Oh, come here. No, I don't think so. So on one day, John Little is watching Faryion Wardrip, and his wife comes. They sit in their car together, and they're talking. And Little notices that as Wardrip gets out, he's got this little paper coffee cup. And he drains the cup, and as he's walking back inside, he throws it into a trash barrel. Well, Texas is an abandoned property state. So anything you put out at the curb, and I think most jurisdictions are like this, but as soon as you put something out at the curb for collection, it is considered abandoned property. And that abandoned property can be picked up by anybody. You don't need a warrant to go through it. You don't need permission to take it. So John Little, acting out of a complete abundance of caution, asked Wardrip, "Hey, do you mind if I fish that cup out so I can spit my dip into it?" And Wardrip's like, "Yeah, okay, go for it." It's kind of a weird request. So Little takes the cup, gets it out of the trash can, carefully collects it, sends it off for DNA comparison, and what do you know? It comes back to Terry Sims and Tony Gibbs' murder. Now, keep in mind, Wardrip's already is out on parole. He's wearing an ankle monitor, and he's been trying to fight to get the ankle monitor removed. So Wardrip contacts his parole officer, and he says, "Hey, have Wardrip come up to Wichita Falls for a talk." And that's all he tells him to do. So the parole officer says, "Hey, I want to talk to you. Come on up here to Wichita Falls." And Wardrip's like, "Yes, awesome. They're going to take my ankle monitor off, and I'm going to get these restrictions. I'm going to have some freedom." That joy was very, very short lived when Little sits down with him and advises him that, hey, we got your DNA and we know you killed Tony Gibbs and we know you killed Terry Sims. Well, Wardrip does his best to not say anything, kind of keeps quiet. About a week goes by. His wife's been up to see him and says, hey, what's going on? The papers up here are reporting that your DNA is a match for two girls that were killed in Wichita Falls. Wardrip, realizing the game's over, calls for John Little to come back to the jail. John Little asks him, okay, you want to talk to me? Yeah, I want to talk to you. All right, hang on a second. Goes through Miranda. Like I said, I don't know what John Little's background is, but he painstakingly seems to have followed every investigative protocol to make sure that this case didn't get kicked. And you know what? Thank goodness that he did. That attention to detail was awesome. So after he's Mirandized, not only, I mean, he's already caught on the Sims and Gibbs killing, but he also admits to Ellen Blau's murder. Now we already know that he confessed to the Tina Kimbrough murder, so now we're up to 4 victims. Just as John Little's getting ready to put an end to everything, he's like, yeah, and there's one more you don't know about. After Tony Gibbs, I went to Fort Worth and I met up with a lady named Deborah Taylor and I killed her too. So John Little was able to close 2 homicides he was certain that Wardrip committed, and he confessed to 2 that he had no idea about. So with Wardrip, Little wanted to know more. It's like, okay, anybody confess, and this is probably pretty close to the time that, what's his name? Henry Lee Lucas, the confession killer, was going around confessing to every murder that had ever happened. I think he even confessed to killing the Kennedys. He was just, you know, if somebody put a murder in front of him, he admitted to it. And I think that being fresh in John Little's mind is probably why he operated out of the abundance of caution that he did. But he asked Wardrip how all this happened. Okay, so remember, 84, we said that Wardrip and his wife were starting to have serious marital difficulties. So with Sims, after fighting with his wife and taking intravenous drugs, he was walking the neighborhood where Lisa Boone lived. He was yelling and screaming, saw Terry Sims on the porch, and before she had a chance to react, he had pushed his way into the home, slammed the door, and began violently throwing her all around the little house. With all of his victims, you'll notice that he says pretty much the exact same things. He's angry at his family. He's angry at his wife. His wife is, leaves him when times are hard, but always wants to come back when everything's good. Blames his wife for everything that's going wrong in his life. And so when he's attacking his victims, he doesn't see the victims. He sees his wife. The victims are surrogates. Now, all of his victims, I said, were around 5 foot tall. I would be willing to bet, I couldn't find a whole lot about her, but I'd be willing to bet that Wardrip's wife was right around 5 foot tall. But he said he never abused his wife, never hit his wife, and even claims that he never hit his victims, which I think is a distinction without a difference. And There's obviously evidence to the contrary, but I think his idea of hitting and using his forearm to apply pressure or bouncing them off of hard surfaces is different than hitting. Like I said, distinction without a difference. Um, he never admits to sexual assault of any of his victims, and he always says something similar, like he blacked out. Now, power control offenders, antisocial personality, mixed typology. This is somebody who I could actually see getting so mad that he can't recall fine details. And when you look at where everything happened, he wasn't driving long distances uh, after these crimes occurred. Whatever distance he was driving, it was places he was familiar with, in neighborhoods he was familiar with, something he could do on autopilot. And so a lot of things he did were muscle memory, locking car doors, rolling up windows, things like that. Um, with Gibbs, Wardrip said that he was walking downtown after having a rough night. Tony Gibbs sees him. They work together at the hospital, so she offered him a ride. Uh, all of a sudden, as soon as he gets in the car, he hears his wife's voice. He looks at Tony, and he immediately begins to attack her, takes her to the field where the trolley car is, and then brings the vehicle back into a neighborhood that he's familiar with. Blau is interesting. Blau was actually looking for somebody, and I don't think anybody ever knew who she was looking for, but Wardrip essentially made contact with her and then carjacked her. And she was attacked in the similar way: asphyxiation, beating, and stabbing. Deborah Taylor in Fort Worth was interesting because he's up there looking for work. He meets Taylor at a honky tonk, and they strike up some kind of friendship. They go out to her car, and Wardrip thinks this is going somewhere. Taylor makes it clear that that's not going to happen, and so he attacks her. All right. The fact that he was in Wichita Falls so close after the Gibbs murder, you could say he was starting to get burnout. You could say he was afraid of getting caught. A lot of times, these guys, it's a pseudo psychological defense mechanism. Like, they know things are closing in, and so to keep everything from collapsing on them, what they're going to do is they're going to try and push themselves away from the situation they've gotten themselves in. But like with Faryion Wardrip, he ended up back in Wichita Falls, picking up almost exactly where he left off. So after getting all this information, the DA decides he's going to charge him. Is there a deal to be made? Absolutely not. He's given the death sentence. So on November 5th, 1999, Wardrip pled guilty to 3 counts of first-degree murder, 2 counts of second-degree murder. In 2010, he did file an appellate case, and you can find it online. I'll put a link in the description. I've read a lot of these per se, meaning done without a lawyer, appeals from working in the prison, and I've got to say, even though Wardrip's appeal didn't go anywhere, it was very well written. But you also kind of get an idea of how his mind works. So if you're interested in that, kind of like with Gerard John Schaefer, when you can read how somebody writes, it's a window into their soul, it's a window into their psyche, and you can really kind of start to see how all the pieces fit together. And I don't know if Wardrip wrote that on his own, or he had a fellow inmate, we call them writ writers in the penitentiary, They're guys who are usually book smart, usually have some type of legal knowledge, and they help. Or maybe Wardrip just being locked down 23 hours a day, almost 7 days a week, uh, got really good at reading and deciphering the law. But like I said, he issued an 8-part appeal, and each part was shot down, and his death sentence was reinstated. All right. He is currently housed at the Pulaski unit of the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, TDCJ, and that's where death row is. And he was issued a 999 inmate identification code. Now, why is that significant? In TDCJ, when you have a 999 inmate identification number, those 3 nines indicate that you are on death row. Those numbers are specifically reserved for those who are on death row. Y'all, that's going to go ahead and bring another episode of Serial Killer Saturdays to a close. I know it's kind of a long one, but I really hope you got some good stuff out of this one. Faryion Wardrip, he's not really a serial killer that a lot of people have heard of. He's kind of one of those regional guys. And I'll be honest, had I not read The Evil That Men Do by Roy Hazelwood, I probably wouldn't have known about him either. But it's a very interesting case for a lot of reasons. There's a lot of really good information in there, and it was kind of cool because Roy Hazelwood actually put the profile together that didn't solve the case. All right, and most profilers will tell you that that's not the purpose of the profile. The profile is to refocus an investigation after all other investigative avenues have collapsed or fallen apart. Now, the fact that John Little was as diligent as he was and went through and reviewed all 3 of those cases through the lens of that profile is what closed the case. And, the rest is history. So, folks, thank you so much for watching. Excuse me. Please like, subscribe, and share on your favorite social media platforms. We're up to 144 subscribers. We've got a little over 7,100 views. The channel's growing. It's not growing as fast as I like, but you know what? I'm not going to sell. I don't just want to put stuff out just for the sake of putting stuff out. I want to put out good stuff, and I want to put out good stuff that people can use. So, y'all, if you enjoyed this edition of Serial Killer Saturdays, please comment about it. And if you have any ideas for serial killers that you'd like to talk about in the future, I'm all ears. I'm always looking for good ideas here on Cowboy Criminology. Y'all, stay safe. Take care of each other. We'll see you next time.